Good morning, everyone. My name is Sam. I'm the hospitality director here at Encounter, and I just want to welcome you all to our service this morning. I also hope you had a wonderful, safe, and happy Thanksgiving. We'll begin shortly with worship, we'll have the sermon, and we'll also partake in communion together. So if you haven't already, maybe pause this video, go ahead and gather your communion elements, and if you will, please join us in worship.
I'm leaning on the everlasting arms that place me on the rock that stands. I hold true to the one who breaks my fall and lifts me time and time again. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. There's freedom purchased by This grace outweighing all my shame. I'm made new through the power of sacrifice. From death now raised to life again. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. I'm not a slave to sin, so I'm singing. You are good, buried with Christ to rise in your freedom. You are good. When you make a promise, Jesus, you keep it. You are good. So I'll praise your name as long as I'm breathing. You are good. I'm not a slave to sin, so I'm singing. You are good, buried with Christ to rise in your freedom. You are good. When you make a promise, Jesus, you keep it. You are good. So I'll praise your name as long as I'm breathing. You are good. Oh my God, so good. You never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. I'm not a slave to sin, so I'm singing. You are good, buried with Christ to rise in your freedom. You are good. When you make a promise, Jesus, you keep it. You are good. So I'll praise your name as long as I'm breathing. You are good.
Hello again, everyone. If you're just joining us, welcome. And if this is your first time joining us, we would love to connect with you. We have a digital connection card. You can go to encounterdc.com/connect. For every connection card we receive, we set aside some money to do some good in our community. We also have a special gift for you for filling out a card. This week begins our Advent series, which is the process of anticipating the coming of Christ. We'll be going through a special series called Honest Advent, which takes a fresh look at Advent themes and how they're relevant to us now. We'll be going through the devotional Honest Advent, which if you're interested in buying the book, you can go to encounterdc.com/Advent. The link will be there, as well as more information. As we go through this series, you'll see we'll have a number of guest speakers because Joel is on paternity leave. The first will be Austin Hedge from the Foundry Church, and he'll be kicking off our Advent series. So please join me in welcoming Austin.
Hey, good morning, Encounter Church. My name is Austin Hedge. I'm on staff at the Foundry Church in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm grateful to be here with you today. I'm excited for Joel and Megan as they welcome Jack into their family. And I'm pumped to kick off this new series, Honest Advent, with you. Now, 2020 has been such a memorable year for all of the wrong reasons, am I right? There's been pain and loss and grief and suffering. Some of us have lost financially. Some of us have lost jobs. Some of us have lost family members, friends. We've lost the ability to celebrate important milestones. There's a lot to grieve about 2020. It's been humongous in the losses that we have all experienced. I think it's important also to note that many of us have lost a lot of smaller things as well. The ability to unwind and to watch a live sporting event at the event, the ability to go and to see our favorite musicians or bands play live music, the ability to see certain friends and certain family members outside of our immediate bubble community. One of the ways that I have experienced these minor losses is that one of my favorite TV shows was canceled for the fall, which is Survivor. Now, I know what many of you are thinking. I know what you're thinking as you're sitting there on your couch listening today. You're thinking, Survivor, that show that was on 20 years ago? Yes, that show that was on 20 years ago. It is one of my favorite shows, absolutely, because I love the strategy of the show. I love the gameplay behind it because I'm a little bit of a nerd, and so I like seeing how it all works together and how someone can come out ahead victorious. And the show has been on for 20 years, running 2 seasons a year. This is actually the first year that it's only had 1 season, dating all the way back to the year 2000. Imagine what life was like in the year 2000 versus right now. One of the things I love most about this show that is exciting is when there are blindsides that happen. When a person places their trust in someone else, only for that person to go and to vote them out without them even seeing it. In Modern Survivor, it's given us so many GIFs that we can have to send to our friends and our families when these moments happen, where someone realizes that they've been betrayed by the people that they had put all of their trust in the game. They're vulnerable. They expose themselves to someone else, hoping that it would get them further along in the game, but in actuality, it leads to their downfall. These bonds are made. And that's what makes it so painful for the people experiencing it. Today, I'm kicking off a new series for you based on the devotion of Honest Advent by Scott Erickson. And the idea of vulnerability is what we're going to be talking about today. In particular, the joy that we find in Jesus' vulnerability. The joy that we find in Jesus' vulnerability in the Advent season. So the question I want us to look at is, where do we see Jesus express this vulnerability in his life? And what does that mean for us? To do this, we'll be looking at 3 distinct experiences of Jesus, 3 examples where Jesus shows this vulnerability that we can learn from. We all know the details surrounding Jesus' birth narrative, right? There's this girl who's a teenage girl named Mary who is betrothed to marry this young man who's really a teenager named Joseph. They're looking for a place to stay as this tyrannical leader is committing an infanticide on their country. They find themselves in this stable at an inn because all the rooms are taken up. Amongst animals, Jesus is born. However, I think we start this narrative at the wrong spot. We often start this narrative at the birth. But I think it's important to look back and to remember the pregnancy. Because yes, while the narrative of Jesus as God being born in a stable amongst livestock during an infanticide is an incredibly vulnerable situation, it is preceded by a more greatly exemplifying idea of what vulnerability is: pregnancy. Because the first idea, the first example of vulnerability of Jesus is seen in utero. See, I'm a dad of 4 kids. I have kids ranging from 7 months to 7 years old. And while each one of their pregnancy stories is different and each one of their birth stories is different, there's a common thread that goes through each and every one of them. And that thread is that from the moment that my wife found out that she was pregnant, sometimes even before, she began to form a bond with the child, with each and every one. But for me, each child was this ethereal thing that was going to happen. Even as I feel the child kicking in my wife's belly, even as I see movement, even as I see growth of a human, it's still this ethereal thing that's going to happen. It's coming. It's coming, and I need to be prepared. But it's not here right now. But for my wife, it was ever present. Because her role in carrying a child was to provide nourishment, to provide rest, to provide energy, and to provide protection for the baby. My role was just to be around, to be excited. In the Gospel of Luke, we read an angel approaching Mary, looking to share with her the news that she would carry, deliver, and parent Jesus. She's told that this child would be conceived not through natural means of conception, but by the Holy Spirit, which is one of those moments in the Bible that I wish there was an extended edition. You know what I mean? In Luke's gospel, Mary's approached by this angel that says, you're going to be pregnant because of the Holy Spirit. And Mary asks one question. So how's this going to happen? And I'm sitting there reading this, and I'm like, what do you mean, how is this going to happen? Don't you have more questions to ask? Surely this conversation between Mary and the angel is longer than this. That the angel didn't just approach Mary and say, this is what's going to happen. And Mary's like, oh yeah, absolutely, for sure, let's do it. But just curious how it's going to happen. Surely there was more to it. But that's all we get. Because Mary obeys in this situation. We read in Paul's letter to the Philippians about Jesus this. It says, who being in very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, by being made in human likeness, and being found in the appearance of a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross. I don't know about you, but immediately when I read this verse, I think about the vulnerability of Jesus in his adulthood. And this vulnerability that Jesus displays in his adulthood is extravagant. And at this time of year, we often think about the vulnerability in connection to Jesus in his childhood, in his infancy. And that vulnerability is extravagant as well. But Jesus, leaving his position, his post in heaven to become a person, he leaves this position to be in utero. This this is an incredibly vulnerable position where he places himself prior to being born. However, I think it's important for us to note as well in this that being in utero is something common to all of us as humans. Without this experience, Jesus would not be able to relate to us. Jesus would have something separating himself from us as humans, because being in utero is a shared experience among all humanity. Now, many of us understand this vulnerability. We understand the vulnerability of being pregnant. We understand how that can be vulnerable for both the woman and for the child. And while modernity has drastically decreased mortality rates for babies and mothers in the birthing process and in pregnancy, we still see that happen, let alone in Jesus' time, 2,000 years ago. However, I think there's another angle to this vulnerability that's important to note, which is actually not something that's shared throughout humanity, but is something that is unique to Jesus and his experience of pregnancy and birth. To share this with you, I'm going to take you to the book of Revelation. And to be honest with you, it's kind of a weird chapter. So it's a strange take on Advent, but it's a vulnerability that Jesus allows himself to enter into. So let me read this for us. Revelation 12, starting in verse 1. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and the crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. Now, if you aren't familiar with the book of Revelation, this passage seems crazy. Am I right? It's weird, it's strange, it's unusual. But Revelation is a book that's written in the apocalyptic genre. It's an ancient genre that's sometimes used in Jewish literature, and it is written at a particular moment to a particular group of people. Oftentimes, it uses symbolism to bring exhortation or encouragement to a group of people who are experiencing some sort of conflict and some sort of pain. So John, one of Jesus' disciples, one of his closest friends, is writing this to the early church, probably about the year 90, where the church is experiencing an immense persecution by Emperor Domitian. John is writing to the early church to encourage them by using these signs and these symbols. So how is he trying to encourage them? Let's check this out by identifying who some of these characters are. It's important to identify them. But first, let's start with the baby. In verse 5, it says that she gave birth to a son who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. Here, John is quoting a messianic passage from Psalm 2, which points to the Messiah. This baby is Jesus. Well, Jesus is the baby, then logically, this woman in the story who is pregnant and giving birth, she must be Mary, right? At which point, we're transported to a woman on the run trying to escape an infanticide, to a woman in a stable, scared, because she's starting to give birth, screaming out in pain, it says in verse 2. We're taken to the birth narrative of Jesus in a really strange way. But there's one more character that we meet later in the chapter. And John thankfully tells us exactly who it is. He says it in verse 9 that we didn't read earlier, but it's the dragon. It says in verse 9, the great dragon, so the third character here, was hurled down. That ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. So the third character here is none other than Satan, symbolized by a dragon who is wanting to devour this infant, this baby Jesus. The vulnerability of Jesus is not just defined by his earthly realities of entering into utero or being born into this earth, but is aided by the spiritual component that is found here in the book of Revelation. It is not just that Jesus is facing a vulnerability that connects to all of us, being an infant, but rather he is an infant that this dragon wants to devour in the spiritual realm. For Jesus to step down from his throne in heaven into earth means he sets himself into this metaphor as the child, as the baby, the vulnerability and all. And while weird, we later read that this dragon is defeated. It's important not to miss the position that Jesus puts himself in, even though we know the dragon is defeated. Very clearly, an infant being placed in front of a dragon is susceptible to harm. Yeah. Why did he do this? Why did he enter into this vulnerable space in the spiritual realm? Why did he put himself in the position of potential harm? He did that for you and for me. Let's keep going. Let's keep finding out this other example. Third example here. We're going to jump to another one of John's works, the Gospel of John, that we find Jesus showing his vulnerability. In John 7, there's a fairly heated exchange that Jesus begins to have over who he is, over his identity, because Jesus begins to claim that he is the Messiah. He is one with God. He is making himself to be a deity. And the Jewish crowds, the people around him, are furious because that is heretical. You don't do that. Who can call themselves one with God or the Messiah? Certainly not this man. Do you know who he is? Do you know about his mom and his dad and how he was born out of wedlock? Do you know what city, what town he was from? Do you know how he fails to obey laws like the Sabbath? Certainly not this man. Jesus doesn't connect to their ideas of what the Messiah should be, because they are waiting for a liberating warrior king Messiah. And Jesus doesn't fit that mold. And that's a conversation for another day, but a question that I think it's always important for us to wrestle with. And the question of, are we making Jesus look more like us or more like himself? Back to John. Jesus is facing this onslaught of attacks about his identity, and everyone around him is hurling those ideas at him of who he should be, who he is, what he should be doing. And then in chapter 8, we find these verses, and he does something pretty cool, in character with him, but pretty astounding as well. It says this in verse 2. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him. He sat down to teach them, and the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. And the law of Moses commands us to stone such a woman. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write in the ground with his finger. When they kept questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first one to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who had heard began to go away one at a time, the older one first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and he asked her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Now go and leave your life of sin. When Jesus' identity is in question, when his actions are attacked, what does he do? He gets down in the dirt. He becomes vulnerable to connect with us. Jesus is drawing in the dirt and asking them, let any one of you who is without sin be the first one to throw a stone at her. And the Pharisees backtracked as if they had lost something. Who is without sin? Who can throw the first stone? It's Jesus. He can do that. He is the sinless one. He can throw the first stone. And yet, what does he do? He lowers himself and becomes vulnerable. Now, there's multiple reasons maybe why this woman is brought here. According to the law of Moses, when two people are caught in adultery, they could have been brought before people to be stoned. But she arrives in an interesting situation. She arrives without a co-conspirator in the adultery. Maybe there's a few reasons for that. Maybe that she was in on this ploy to try to trick Jesus. The sin is a lie, and really, she's working with the religious leaders and the Pharisees, trying to get Jesus to do something that he shouldn't be doing. Or maybe the religious leaders are so quick to catch Jesus in the act that they are looking for any way to catch him doing something heretical. They're quick to maybe shift the law to their own advantage by only grabbing the woman. Or maybe they just see the woman there and they go, okay, well, I'll just grab you and rather than the man too. Or third, maybe there's some misogynistic undertones where the woman is tricked into the act that could lead her to being stoned by a person who is protected by religious leaders. Or maybe the man is given a pass while the woman is facing this retribution. While the first one seems least likely here, the most far-fetched idea, I think it's probably that one of the latter two are the true examples. In both cases, this woman is in the pits of despair. She is in a low place. She is at the mercy of her accusers. Have you experienced this? Have you experienced this where it feels like everything around you is caving in? People are willing to mistreat you, abandon you. And where is Jesus when this happens? What is his position? He is right next to you. He is in the mud. He's down on his knees, meeting you where you are. You are not alone there. When you've been accused of something, whether true or false, he is next to you. When you feel as though no one has your back in a situation and that it's going to turn out poorly regardless, he is in the mud with you. The position of Jesus is a vulnerable one where he finds himself aligning with the sinful person who is being charged with an act that would lead to stoning. He's backing the one that no one else is backing. He's backing the underdog, the undervalued, the overlooked, the hurt, the broken, the devastated person. What is more vulnerable than putting your whole reputation on the line? To stand next to someone, in front of someone who society doesn't think is deserving. What is more vulnerable than placing yourself next to someone who is being publicly condemned to be stoned? What is more vulnerable than to meet us where we're at? In the devastation of 2020, in the midst of chaos, in the moments of abandonment, when we make mistakes, when we're feeling hurt. Because it's here that Jesus gets on his knees sacrificing his position, placing himself in the dirt alongside us. He doesn't wait for an explanation. He doesn't wait for all the details to come in. He doesn't wait for litigation to happen in the situation. Instead, he gets in the mud. He places himself in this vulnerable position next to us, next to this woman. And it is in Jesus' vulnerability that we can find joy. A joy that is so often associated with the season, am I right? A joy that transcends worldly pleasure, a joy that only comes from the vulnerability that's found in Christ. And it says a lot about the character of God that he would enter into these examples, allowing himself to be vulnerable. So what do we do with this joy that we find in Christ's vulnerability? Let me give you 3 things as we close. First, be real with where you're at and be real with who's next to you. 2020 has been tough. Personally, this year has been one of the hardest years that I've ever experienced in my life. I've experienced more loss and pain and disappointment and grief and despair and anxiety and depression than any other year of my life. And I'm sure many of you can relate. Maybe this week has been incredibly hard for you, being apart from family, being devastated by just the sheer number of people who maybe passed away this week. I would encourage you to admit this to God. Admit where you're actually at. Admit the loss and the grief and the pain and the lament. But don't forget to admit that who is alongside you. Don't forget to remind yourself that you are not alone. That Jesus is here in the mess. He's here in the muck with you. Second, find moments to live out this joy. Much can be said about the joy that we should experience because of Christ's connection to us. It is a fallacy to think that when we are in the mud, that we cannot live out moments of joy or realize the opportunities that come from these moments. One example of that this year is that my wife and I decided to homeschool our oldest son, and for a variety of reasons. And some days end in tears and frustration and anger and unproductivity. But it has forced me to slow down and to spend more time with him. It is a grind. It is exhausting. But we can find joy and celebrate together, even as we're walking through the dirt, through the mud. Third, bring joy to someone else. Bring this joy of Christ's vulnerability to someone else. Who do you need to get in the mud with? Who have you seen struggling? Who have you seen hurting, suffering, and yet you've been unwilling to put your hand in the mud with them? Emmanuel Katongel says this: when we draw near to those who are most sinned against, or the vulnerable, our call is not first to make a difference, but allow the pain of that encounter to disturb us. It disturbs Jesus when this woman is thrown at his feet, and it should disturb us when we engage with those who are in the mud. Whose hurt and whose pain needs to disturb you this week? And how can you get low with them? May you remember the unfathomable vulnerability of Jesus. May a red dragon appear amongst your nativity so that you may remember the spiritual realities of what is happening this Christmas season. And may you find joy in the vulnerability of Jesus as he gets in the dirt with you.
Hey, Encounter, Joel here. I want to bring just a moment of reflection as we approach communion today. We're listening about this idea of vulnerability, right? How when Jesus comes into the world, incarnation, he becomes the most vulnerable being there is. He's a baby. I just became a father. Man, I just became parent, so we know about that. We know what it's like to have a baby that's so vulnerable. But there's another moment in the story of Jesus where he's even more vulnerable. That's at the cross. And the thing that we remember when we celebrate communion is precisely that, the vulnerability of God. Jesus gathers his disciples around the table and presents himself in the most vulnerable of ways. A body broken, a blood poured out. So my invitation for you today is, as we come to the table, that you will have that image, that the same God of strength and power that speaks the universe into existence is the God who in Jesus Christ offers himself up in the most vulnerable of ways for our salvation. Let's pray. Dear God, we come before you aware of how vulnerable the incarnation is for Jesus, how vulnerable Jesus makes himself not only as a baby but as a man who would offer up his life, his body, to save a broken humanity. So as we come to the table today, God, our prayer is that we will remember that your Spirit will make us aware of the Jesus that lies helpless, dying, so we could be saved. On the night when Jesus was betrayed, the story tells us that he took bread, and that after giving thanks, he broke it and he said to his disciples, "This is my body broken for you." Let's take the bread. In the same way, after taking the bread, he took the cup. And after giving thanks, he took it and he said to his disciples, "This is the blood of my new covenant, poured out for you, for the forgiveness of sins." The thing that God accomplishes through the vulnerability of Christ giving himself for us. Let's take the cup. The story says that after he took the bread and the cup, that he told his disciples that every time we do this, that we are announcing the Lord's death until his return. So today we proclaim the mystery of our faith. Christ has died, Christ has risen, and Christ will come again.
And I searched the world, but it couldn't fill me. And man's empty praise and treasures of fame are never enough. Then you came along and put me back together. And every desire is now satisfied here in your love. Oh,
Before we close, I just want to thank everyone who's been so generous during this time and to encourage you to continue to be giving. If you'd like to give, you can go to encounterdc.com/give. You can make a one-time gift, or you can set up recurring giving. Next week, join us as Josh Burnett, CEO of Flourish, will continue our Advent series. He'll talk about what the Advent season teaches us about love.
And now for a word of benediction. May you learn to recognize the presence of God, the companionship of God, the power of God in the vulnerable moments of life. When you feel at your weakest, when you feel at your lowest, when you feel like you have nothing to offer, when you feel like you're exposed and you need somebody to protect you, in those moments, may you know that Jesus joins you there. As a baby who needs others to protect him. As a grown man who is falsely accused and executed and is not able to defend himself. May you learn in those moments that God has joined you in your vulnerability so that you wouldn't walk through those moments alone. May grace and peace be with you.